Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really jumping into the history of Hawaii. We've got quite a bit to work with: articles, some research, our notes.
Yeah, a good stack.
So the goal here is to kind of pull out the main story, right? The really key moments, the big shifts that shaped the islands, from those first Polynesian rivals all the way to becoming the 50th state.
Exactly. We want to hit the highlights, maybe some surprising bits, but without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Okay, let's get into it then. Where do we even start? The first people arriving.
Right. And even that, the timing isn't totally set in stone. The latest carbon dating, it seems to point towards sometime between, say, 940 and 1200 AD.
Oh, okay.
But, it wasn't always agreed upon. There were older ideas, maybe as early as 300 AD. Some thought maybe more like 600 to 800 AD.
So our understanding just keeps refining itself with new evidence.
Pretty much, yeah. Science marches on, you could say.
And back then, obviously, no written records for those earliest periods. It was all passed down how?
Through these incredible oral traditions. Genealogy chants, mainly. These aliʻi, they trace the royal lines all the way back to the gods.
Wow. That's powerful. Yeah. History and social status all wrapped up in spoken word and memory.
Absolutely fundamental. Then fast forward a bit, maybe around 1200 AD, things seem to shift again. There's this figure, a Tahitian priest named Pau.
Okay, Pau. What did he bring?
Well, tradition credits him with bringing, or at least formalizing, a new social structure. More rigid classes.
Like a caste system?
Sort of, yeah. You had the aliʻi at the very top, the high chief, the king. Then below them, the aha kahuna, like a council of chiefs, advisors. Then the aliʻi, who were the nobles, the kahuna priests, experts, skilled craftsmen, the makaina, the common people, and then at the bottom, the kaso, who were outcasts, maybe slaves.
So a much more defined hierarchy than perhaps what was there before.
Seems that way. Before that, you certainly had rulers, the noho aliʻi, who ruled specific areas, tracing their lineage back to figures like Hanalawanui. And they definitely had rules, the kapu system.
The kapu system. I've heard of that. Very strict, right?
Extremely. It governed, well, pretty much everything. How people interacted, who could fish, where and when. Even rules about men and women eating together. That was a big one, the ai kapu.
And breaking kapu had serious consequences.
Oh, yeah. You could be considered aya, ungodly, maybe cursed. It wasn't something taken lightly. It was tied directly into their religious beliefs.
Which is more polytheistic, right?
Yeah.
Multiple gods.
Definitely. You have the big four, Kani, Ku, Lono, and Kanaloa, but also many others, like Pele, the volcano goddess, who's probably the most famous today.
And family guardians, too.
Right, the Aumakua, like Ilani, a hawk figure seen as a protector for some Ali lines. The whole pantheon was incredibly complex, the four major gods, then maybe 40 aspects of Kani, 400 lesser deities, spirits, guardians. It was vast.
It sounds incredibly rich. And they were connected to Tahiti, originally. Those voyages.
Yes, there seems to have been pretty regular voyaging back and forth for a while, but then around 1300 AD, maybe a bit later, that contact seems to stop.
Why? Do we know?
Not definitively. Could be environmental changes, shifts in power, maybe resource depletion. We don't really know. But the result was centuries of relative isolation for Hawaii.
Which must have let their own unique culture really develop and diverge.
Exactly. And that isolation might be why, when Europeans first arrived, there wasn't one single name for the whole island chain.
Right. Captain Cook called them the Sandwich Islands.
He did, after his patron, the Earl of Sandwich. It wasn't until Kamehameha unified the islands much later that the name Hawaii, originally just the name of the big island, was applied to the entire archipelago.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those figures before unification. Liloa, you mentioned him, late 15th century.
Yeah, Liloa, a very important chief on the big island. His base was in the Waipio Valley, a really sacred and fertile place. His lineage was considered very high, tracing back to creation figures.
And he had significant sons.
Two key ones. Hakau, the firstborn from his official wife, Pinea, who was also his aunt.
Okay, common practice then among high alio.
Yes, to keep the bloodline pure. And then there was Umi Aloa, or just Umi, whose mother, Akahia Kuleana, was of lesser rank.
So Hakau was the heir.
Hakau inherited the rule, yeah. But Liloa gave the religious authority, looking after the war god Ku, specifically to Umi.
Interesting split. And we actually have something tangible from Liloa, don't we?
Amazingly, yes. His sacred feathered sash, the ko'i, it's preserved at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. A direct link.
Incredible. And Liloa's own family tree shows how complex these lines were.
Absolutely. Father Kiha Nui Lulu Moku traced back to Hanalawanui, Mother Waialoa from Oahu chiefly lines. Other sons whose descendants became prominent, like the Kaiakea family on Molokai. Lineage was everything.
So, Liloa dies, Hukau rules. Umi has religious duties. How did that work out?
Not well initially. Hukau was supposed to treat Umi well, like his man, but he turned out to be quite cruel and jealous.
How? Oh.
Yeah, Umi eventually went into self-imposed exile to avoid Hukau's anger, but Liloa had given Umi some important royal tokens before he died.
Signs of his status.
Exactly, like a niho palawa, that distinctive whale tooth pendant on braided human hair, symbols of his high birth, even if his mother wasn't the highest rank.
And Hukau's cruelty extended beyond his brother.
It did, and this was his undoing. He seriously disrespected two high-ranking priests, Nunu and Kahohe, from the Lono priesthood.
How so?
They came to him ill, seeking aid, maybe food, and he basically turned them away. A huge insult, especially given Umi's connection to the religious side. You just didn't treat kahuna like that.
Bad move, so the priests weren't happy.
Not at all. They resented Hukau deeply and started plotting with another chief, Kauleoku, to support Umi instead.
So the opportunity came.
It did. Hukau sent warriors out to collect feathers, likely for religious or status items. Umi supporters intercepted them, pretended to be bringing offerings to Hukau.
A trap.
Pretty much. They got close and then attacked, stoning Hukau to death.
Wow. So Umi takes over.
Yes. And Umialoa is remembered very differently. As a just ruler, deeply religious, and the one who eventually united most, if not all, of Hawaii Island. His story is a classic hero saga. He also made a strategic marriage to Princess Paikea from Maui.
How did Umi first get recognized, though, coming back from exile?
That's a key part of the story. His mother, Akahi, had kept those royal tokens safe, the malo, the chiefly loincloth, and that lei niopalawa. She revealed them. When Umi showed up at Liloa's royal compound, which was guarded, wearing these, people knew who he was.
Instant recognition.
Pretty much. Even Hukau initially had to acknowledge him, though the plan was still for Hukau to rule, but Umi's influence just grew.
And during his exile, he wasn't just hiding.
No, he was building support, making alliances, marrying women of rank, including his own half-sister Kapukini and the daughter of the ruler of Hilo. He gathered followers. So after Hukau was killed, Umi had the strength to consolidate power over the whole island.
And he ruled differently.
Very much so. He rewarded the people who helped him, brought key companions and the kahuna into his governing circle, learned from Hukau's mistakes, basically. Respect and alliances were key.
Okay, this period also had some interesting social customs, like icon relationships.
Yes, that's something that often surprises people. Icon refers to generally same-sex relationships, often intimate, primarily between men, though maybe women too. It was an accepted, even honored tradition, especially among the aliʻi.
Honored?
Yes. Liloa himself is sometimes credited with institutionalizing it among the chiefs. Warriors often had these bonds. It wasn't hidden. It was part of the social fabric. Early European visitors even wrote about it.
Really? Cook's expedition.
Yeah, Lieutenant James King, who completed Cook's journals, noted that basically all the chiefs had male partners, their icon. He said having one was considered an honor for the companion. John Ledyard, an American with Cook, also described it. It challenges assumptions about pre-contact societies.
Definitely broadens the perspective. Okay, let's talk about land. The Ahupua system, that seems really central.
It is a very sophisticated way of dividing and managing land. Think of the island, Mokupuni, divided into large districts, moku. Then each moku was divided into these wedge-shaped units called ahupu.
Running from the mountains to the sea, right?
Exactly. Malguka to Makai. From the high forests down the slopes, through the agricultural lands to the coast and the fishing grounds.
So each community had access to everything they needed.
That was the genius of it. Timber, taro land, sweet potato fields, coastal resources. It promoted self-sufficiency and likely made travel easier within the Ahupua, often following streams. There's some thought that Umi might have been the one to really establish or formalize the system island-wide.
And how was it managed? What were the guiding ideas?
It was underpinned by values like aloha, love, compassion, lalima, cooperation, working together, and malama, taking care of the land and resources. The goal was pono, achieving balance, harmony, righteousness.
Who was in charge on the ground level?
That would be the konohiki. He was the head man of the Ahupua, appointed by the local aliʻi, basically a land agent or steward. The konohiki, often working with the kahuna, would regulate things like fishing seasons, water use, gathering of resources to ensure sustainability.
So conservation was built in.
Very much so. Even the boundaries were marked by ahu stone piles, often with offerings, like a carved pig's head, symbolizing abundance and the connection between the land and the gods, particularly Lono.
And their farming was pretty advanced, too. Taro, of course.
Oh, yeah. Irrigated pond fields, the lu kalo for wet taro, but also rain-fed gardens, mala for things like sweet potatoes, wala, yams, dryland taro, plus coconuts, new breadfruit, bananas, sugarcane, ko. They cultivated kuki trees for nuts, oil, shade.
And animals, fish ponds.
They had domesticated dogs, chickens, pigs. And yes, the lokoia, the fish ponds, were incredible feats of engineering and aquaculture. Managing water was obviously crucial.
So you had the aliʻi nui at the top, lesser chiefs, and then the kanahiki managing the hupua.
Right. The kanahiki's role was vital, overseeing the land, water rights, making sure people had plots, kuleana to farm, collecting tribute for the chief. Later on, after Western contact, their role kind of morphed into tax collectors and fishery wardens, too.
Okay, so this whole intricate system, the kapu, the religion, the social structure, it seems incredibly stable. But then you mentioned something earlier. It got overthrown internally.
Yes. This is a huge point, often missed. In 1819, before the main wave of missionaries arrived, Hawaiians themselves dismantled the kapu system.
How did that happen?
It was led from the top. Kamehameha had just died. His son, Leo, became Kamehameha II. But Kamehameha Serta's powerful widow, Queen Kahermanu, and Leo's own mother, Queen Keopuolani, who was the highest-ranking person in the kingdom by blood, convinced him...
Convinced him to do what?
To break the most sacred kapu, the kapu, eating together, men and women. Leo publicly sat down and ate with Kahumanu and Keopuolani.
Whoa. That must have sent shockwaves.
Absolutely. And significantly, the highest priest, Huahua, supported it. He even ordered the destruction of the hio, the temples, and the idols.
Was there resistance?
There was. Kamehameha I's nephew, Kekuaokalani, who held the war god, Kukulimoku, led a brief civil war to try and preserve the kapu system. But he was defeated at the Battle of Kwamu. The old ways were officially over, decided by Hawaiians themselves.
That's really significant. It changes the narrative about external forces completely changing things. They were already in massive transition.
Precisely. Which maybe made the arrival of missionaries and other Western influences later have a different kind of impact than it might have otherwise.
Okay, so speaking of external forces, Cook arrived in 1778. But was he really the first European? There's speculation about the Spanish, right?
There is. It's one of those historical what-ifs. The Spanish had the Manila Galleon trade route, sailing between Mexico and the Philippines for centuries, from 1565 all the way to 1815.
So they were in the neighborhood, basically.
Exactly. It's plausible a ship could have been blown off course, sighted the islands, maybe even wrecked. There are some old maps, like one by Ortelius from 1589, that show islands roughly where Hawaii is, but it's not conclusive.
And that story about the captured Spanish chart.
Right. Commodore Anson in 1743 captured a galleon with a chart showing islands around Hawaii's latitude. One was called La Mesa, the table, which some thought could be Hawaii Island, maybe referring to Mauna Loa's flat top.
But most historians doubt it.
The consensus is still that there's no definitive proof of sustained pre-Cook European contact. Oral traditions sometimes mention castaways, possibly Spanish, who might have integrated, but Cook's arrival in 1778 is the first documented, undeniable contact.
And that arrival... it started friendly enough.
Initially, yes. He landed first on Kauai, got provisions, returned later that year, visited Maui, then Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island in early 1779. The reception there was initially overwhelming, possibly linked to the timing with the Makahiki festival for the god Lono.
But it ended badly.
Tragically, yes. He left, but had to return to Kealakekua Bay for repairs after damaging a mast. This time, tensions were higher. Misunderstandings escalated, a boat was stolen, Cook tried to take the ruling chief Kalani Apu hostage, and in the ensuing conflict, Cook was killed.
A massive turning point.
Huge. After Cook, the trickle became a flood. More European and American ships, explorers, traders, and especially whalers started stopping in Hawaii. It was a perfect mid-Pacific spot for supplies and repairs.
And this brought changes. Not all good.
Definitely not. New trade goods, tools, weapons, yes. But also diseases the Hawaiians had no immunity to. Sexually transmitted diseases were a big problem, though interestingly, Cook's own journals suggest they might have already existed there to some degree before his arrival. But the scale certainly increased.
This period of increasing contact sets the stage for the kingdom, right? With Kamehameha I.
Exactly. Kamehameha I, who finally unified all the islands under his rule by 1810, officially founding the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1795, under the House of Kamehameha. His story is epic.
His background is complex, too, isn't it? Paternity questions.
A bit murky, yeah. His mother, Kamakamoku, was high-ranking. His acknowledged father was Quechua. But there were strong rumors, even then, that his biological father might have been Kekili II, the powerful ruler of Maui. Quechua definitely recognized him as aliʻi, though.
And his birth. Legends around that.
Yes, the exact date is debated, maybe around 1736, maybe later. Some traditions link his birth to the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1758, seeing it as an omen. His birth name was Pea, meaning hard-shelled crab, but he became known as Kamehameha, the Lonely One, or the One Set Apart. Prophecies foretold he would unite the islands.
And he was raised in secret for a while.
Initially, yes, due to those prophecies causing fear among rivals. He was eventually raised by his uncle Kalaniʻupu, the chief cook encountered. Kalaniʻupu apparently warned him about plots against his life.
So when Kalaniʻupu died...
In 1782, that sparked the conflict. Kalaniʻupu's son, Koala, became the ruler, but Kamehameha was given guardianship of the war god Kukailimoku. That division didn't last. War broke out almost immediately. Koala was killed at the Battle of Mokushai.
And that started Kamehameha's long campaign.
15 years of intense warfare. He had to defeat other major chiefs on Hawaii Island, like Quechua, a different Quechua, his cousin and rival, and Keoemohilili. Then he moved on to the other islands.
The story of Quechua's death is controversial.
It is. Quechua was Kamehameha's last major rival on the Big Island. He was apparently coming to meet Kamehameha, possibly to negotiate peace. At Pukaho'olaheru, a massive temple Kamehameha had built. As Quechua landed, he was attacked and killed. Whether Kamehameha ordered it directly is debated.
And he got help from Europeans, the British.
Yes. Captain George Vancouver visited several times in the 1790s. He helped negotiate what the British saw as a cession of Hawaii Island in 1794, though historians argue it was more likely understood by Hawaiians as an alliance or protectorate. Vancouver's men also provided military advice and helped build Kamehameha's first Western-style ship, the Britannia.
And the flag.
Vancouver presented Kamehameha with a British red ensign. Versions of British flags were used unofficially until 1816, and the British Union Jack still forms the canton of the modern Hawaiian state flag, a direct legacy of that early relationship.
After securing Hawaii Island, he moved on Maui and Oahu.
Right. After Kahekili II died in 1794, there was a civil war on Maui and Oahu. Kamehameha took advantage, invaded, conquered Maui and Molokai, and then faced Kalanikupule, Kahekili's son, on Oahu.
The Battle of Nuuanu.
The decisive one, yes. Famous for Kamehameha's forces driving Kalanikupule's warriors up Nuuanu Valley and forcing many over the sheer cliffs, the Pali.
Brutal. And he built Western-style buildings.
His first major one was the Brick Palace in Lahaina, Maui, built between 1798 and 1802, possibly by Australian ex-convicts. It was intended for his favorite wife, Kahumanu, but apparently she refused to live in it, preferring traditional structures. Lahaina served as the capital until 1845.
But Kauai held out.
For a while, yes. Kamehameha attempted invasions, but was thwarted by storms and perhaps disease. Finally, in 1810, King Kamoali of Kauai saw the writing on the wall. He peacefully negotiated, agreeing to become a vassal of Kamehameha, ruling Kauai under him. Unification was complete.
Kamehameha's wives were important too, right? Ketchupalani and Kahuma.
Hugely important. Kamulani was his sacred wife, the highest-ranking aliʻi in the land. Her children, Liolio, Kamehameha II, and Kauikauli, Kamehameha III, had unquestionable legitimacy as heirs. Kauamanu was his favorite wife, intelligent, politically savvy, and very influential.
So when Kamehameha died in 1819, Leo took over.
Yes, as Kamehameha II. But Kamehameha had also arranged for Kauamani to share power, creating a unique office, Kuhina Nui, kind of like a prime minister or co-ruler. She wielded immense authority.
And they were the ones who oversaw the Aino, the end of the kapu system.
Correct. That dramatic public meal breaking the eating kapu. As we said, it led to that brief civil war where Kokokalani was defeated, cementing the end of the old state religion.
Tragically, Kamehameha II didn't reign long.
No. He and his favorite wife, Queen Kamamalu, decided to visit England in 1823, partly for diplomacy, partly curiosity. But they both contracted measles in London in 1824 and died. A huge blow.
Their bodies were returned.
Yes, aboard a British warship, HMS Blonde, commanded by Lord Byron, a cousin of the poet. The governor of Oahu, Boki, had accompanied them to London and returned with their remains.
And this period saw key figures converting to Christianity.
It did. While Kamehameha II and Kamamalu were away, or perhaps just after their deaths, several high-profile figures converted, including Boki's wife Liliha, the chief Kekuanisha, and crucially, the powerful Kuhina Nui Kahumanu.
Kahumanu's conversion must have been hugely influential.
Immensely. As the effective senior ruler, her embrace of Christianity gave it legitimacy and momentum. She began enforcing Christian-influenced policies. She even appointed Boki as Kuhina Nui after her, but he got lost at sea on a sandalwood expedition.
Lost at sea.
Yeah. Took ships to the South Pacific looking for sandalwood, vanished. His wife Liliha then tried to stage a revolt against Kahumanu's authority, maybe to seize power herself, but Kahumanu put it down and appointed Kina, Kamehameha's daughter, as co-governor of Oahu instead.
Kahumanu herself.
Yeah.
She wasn't the highest born.
No, her lineage was aliʻi, but not top tier like Kachubulani's. Born on Maui around 1777. Became Kamehameha's consort when she was maybe only 14. Vancouver described her as quite striking and intelligent. Though she and Kamehameha had no children, he agreed her children would have been heirs. She essentially adopted Liolio. As regent, she ruled with, as one observer put it, unbound authority and respect.
And the American missionaries arrived right around this time, 1820.
Just as this internal religious shift was solidifying, the Pioneer Company of American Protestant Missionaries, mostly from New England, arrived in 1820. Their influence over the next 40 years was profound.
How so? Beyond conversions.
They developed a written form of the Hawaiian language using the Latin alphabet, which was huge for literacy and standardization. They established schools, spread English, but controversially, they also actively discouraged many aspects of traditional Hawaiian culture, like hula and chanting, viewing them as pagan.
And Kahumanu pushed their agenda after her conversion?
Very much so. Her public conversion in 1824 was a major event. She backed the missionaries, implemented laws based on Christian morals, like the ban on hula in 1830.
So after Kahumanu and Liolio, we get Kamehameha III.
Right. Kakiuli, Liolio's younger brother, also a son of Kamehameha I and Kichipilani, born probably around 1814. There's a story he was stillborn but revived by a kahuna. He came to the throne as a child in 1825 after his brother's death, with Kahumanu initially ruling for him.
He reigned for a long time.
The longest of any Hawaiian monarch until 1854, his reign saw massive changes. He oversaw the transition to a constitutional monarchy, developing formal laws, creating a more Western-style government structure.
Why the shift to Western law?
Partly influence from advisors like the missionary William Richards, but also a pragmatic response to increasing pressure from foreign powers, Britain, France, the U.S. They needed laws and treaties that foreigners would recognize to maintain independence.
And the first constitution, 1840.
Yes. And it was quite progressive for its time, actually recognizing equal voting rights, though perhaps not fully implemented initially, regardless of race, gender, or wealth. It also established a legislature.
You brought in other reforms, too. Human rights, land.
Yes, recognized basic human rights. And then there was the Mahela in 1848. This was a huge, complex, and ultimately controversial land redistribution.
The Great Mahele. What was the idea?
The idea was to transition from the traditional communal land system to private land ownership, partly to protect lands from foreign claims by giving individuals, including commoners, fee simple title.
But it didn't quite work out that way.
Not entirely. It was confusing. Many commoners didn't understand the process or couldn't afford the fees to register their claims, kuleana lands. Ultimately, large amounts of land ended up concentrated in the hands of the monarchy, the government, chiefs, and significantly foreign residents. It laid the groundwork for the later sugar plantations.
He also moved the capital.
Yes, from Lahaina, Maui to Honolulu, Oahu in 1845, recognizing Honolulu's growing importance as a port and commercial center.
And his reign saw that brief British takeover.
The Paulet Affair in 1843, Lord George Paulet, a British naval captain, exceeded his orders and forced Kamehameha III to cede the islands under threat of violence. It lasted about 5 months.
How is independence restored?
Kamehameha III had secretly sent envoys to Britain to appeal. The British government repudiated Paulet's actions, and Admiral Richard Thomas arrived to restore sovereignty on July 31st, 1843. That's when Kamehameha III supposedly uttered the famous phrase, "Uamauke oka uina ikapono." The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness, became the motto of Hawaii.
And that day is still celebrated.
Laiahui is Sovereignty Restoration Day, a significant holiday for many.
Kamehameha III's family. Succession.
He married Queen Kalama in 1837. They had 2 sons who died very young. He also had a son, Albert Edward Kuniakea, with his mistress, Jane Lahilahi, who was also high aliʻi. But he adopted his nephew, Alexander Liolio, son of Kino, as his heir.
So Alexander Liolio became Kamehameha I.
Yes, when Kamehameha III died in 1854. Alexander Liolio, or Kamehameha IV, reigned from 1854 to 1863.
What marked his reign?
He was educated at the chief's children's school, quite cosmopolitan. He'd traveled abroad with his brother Lot to the U.S., Britain, France. He was quite wary of American influence and aimed to counterbalance it, strengthening ties with Britain and France. He actually ended negotiations that were leaning towards annexation by the U.S.
And his wife, Queen Emma.
Yes, he married Emma Rook in 1856. She was part Hawaiian, part British, a great-grandniece of Kamehameha I, and very pro-British. They were a popular royal couple. Tragically, their only son, Prince Albert Edward Kakiuli, died at age 4, likely from appendicitis or maybe meningitis, a devastating blow.
He focused on healthcare, too.
Very much so. Seeing the devastating effects of introduced diseases on the Hawaiian population, he and Queen Emma championed healthcare initiatives. They personally raised funds to establish the Queen's Hospital in Honolulu, which still exists today. They also helped establish the Anglican Church in Hawaii, partly as a counter to American missionary influence.
And an earlier healthcare plan failed.
Yeah, interestingly, a broad public health care plan proposed earlier had been struck down under the 1852 Constitution, so they took a more direct, charitable approach with the hospital.
Kamehameha I also died young.
Yes, in 1863, only 29. Officially from chronic asthma, but likely worsened by grief over his son's death and perhaps other issues. He was succeeded by his older brother, Lot Kapuewa,
who became Kamehameha V.
Right. And Kamehameha V had different ideas about the Constitution. He thought the 1852 one gave too much power away from the monarchy. He actually refused to take the oath to uphold it and instead promulgated a new constitution in 1864, which restored some monarchical power and instituted property and literacy requirements for voting, disenfranchising many Hawaiians. He reigned until his death in 1872, unmarried and without naming an heir.
Which led to
the first popular election for a monarch in Hawaii in 1873. The candidates were William Charles Lunalilo, a high chief known for being popular and liberal, and David Kalakaua. Lunalilo won easily, but died just over a year later, also without an heir.
So another election.
Yes, in 1874. This time it was Kalakaua against Queen Emma, Kamehameha V's widow. It was a bitter contest.
Kalakaua won.
He did, supported more by the business community and perhaps those wary of Queen Emma's strong pro-British stance. But her supporters were furious.
Riots.
Serious riots broke out in Honolulu, attacking legislators who had voted for Kalakaua. The government had to ask for help from American and British warships in the harbor to land troops and restore order. Not a great start to his reign.
And during Kalakaua's time, the U.S. pressure for Pearl Harbor really increased.
It did. Whaling was declining sharply by then. Sugar was king.
Right, the plantations. Started small but grew fast.
First permanent one on Kauai in 1835. By the 1860s, they were on all the main islands, totally transforming the economy and landscape.
And the plantation owners, mostly American or European, wanted more political power. The Maili helped them get land.
Indirectly, yes. And they pushed hard for closer ties with the U.S., especially for sugar tariffs. Kamehameha III had tried for a reciprocity treaty back in the 1850s, but it failed.
Pearl Harbor became key for the U.S. military, too.
Strategic location for controlling the Pacific. There was even a proposal around 1873 by Charles Reed Bishop, who was foreign minister then and married to Bernice Pauahi Bishop, the last direct descendant of Kamehameha I.
To sell Pearl Harbor.
Essentially offer it to the U.S. for a treaty. But Bernice Pauahi apparently disapproved strongly, and Hawaiian public opinion was very against giving up land. Lunalilo canceled those talks.
But Kalana managed to get a treaty.
He did. He took a state visit to Washington, D.C. in 1874, the first monarch to do so. Congress finally agreed to the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875. Hawaiian sugar could enter the U.S. duty-free for 7 years.
And in return?
In return, Hawaii promised not to lease or grant territory to any other foreign power. Critically, a later renewal and amendment in 1887 explicitly granted the United States the exclusive right to use Pearl Harbor as a naval base.
That treaty must have supercharged the sugar industry.
Absolutely. Production boomed, but it also tied Hawaii's economy inextricably to the U.S. and increased the power of the planter class.
Which led to the Bayonet Constitution.
Directly. 1887. The sugar planters and business community felt Kalakaua was spending too much, trying to revive Hawaiian culture, like the hula, which they disliked, and was too independent. They formed a secret group, the Hawaiian League, backed by an armed militia, the Honolulu Rifles.
Mostly non-Hawaiians.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Led by people like Lorrin Thurston, grandson of missionaries. They basically presented Kalakaua with an ultimatum and a new constitution they had written.
Threatened him.
Yes. Surrounded his palace with their militia. He had little choice but to sign it. It drastically reduced the monarch's power, making him essentially a figurehead.
And voting rights.
This is crucial. It disenfranchised most native Hawaiians by imposing high property ownership requirements for voting, which few met. It also disenfranchised Asian immigrants entirely. But incredibly, it gave voting rights to wealthy American and European residents, even if they weren't citizens of Hawaii.
So power shifted decisively to the foreign business interests.
Completely. It paved the way for annexation. There was resistance, like Robert Wilcox's rebellion in 1889, trying to restore the old constitution, but it failed. Kalakaua even reportedly offered the throne to his sister, Liliuokalani, hoping she could resist the missionary party better, but she refused then.
Kalakaua died in 1891.
Yes, while visiting San Francisco. So his sister, Liliuokalani, became queen. She later called his reign a golden age materially, despite the political turmoil.
But she inherited a tough situation. Economic problems.
Big time. The McKinley Tariff Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1890, removed the duty-free advantage Hawaiian sugar had enjoyed under reciprocity. It devastated the Hawaiian economy, making annexation seem more attractive to the planters as a way to get back inside the U.S. tariff wall.
And Liliuokalani tried controversial things. Lottery, opium.
She proposed them as ways to raise government revenue, yes, a national lottery and licensing opium sales. But her ministers, largely aligned with the business interests, opposed these strongly.
Her main goal was restoring power to the monarchy.
That became her focus. In early 1893, she drafted a new constitution to replace the Bayonet Constitution. It would have restored the monarch's veto power, removed the property requirements for voting, enfranchising more Hawaiians, and taken voting rights away from non-citizen Europeans and Americans.
Did she have support?
Significant support from native Hawaiians. There were petitions, public rallies, but her own cabinet refused to sign off on it, fearing the reaction from the opposition.
And that attempt triggered the overthrow.
It was the pretext, yes. The same group, essentially, that forced the Bayonet Constitution, now calling themselves the Committee of Safety, claimed the Queen was attempting an illegal revolution. January 17th, 1893.
Their goal was explicitly annexation.
Yes. Depose the Queen, end the monarchy, and join the United States. Led again by Lorrin Thurston, backed by the mostly American and European business elite and the old Reform Party members.
And the U.S. played a direct role.
A critical and controversial role. The kingdom's marshal, Wilson, warned the government about the coup and asked for arrest warrants for the committee members, but the attorney general, who was sympathetic to them, refused. Crucially, the U.S. minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, was an ardent annexationist.
What did Stevens do?
He ordered U.S. Marines and sailors from the warship USS Boston, which was conveniently in Honolulu Harbor, to land. Officially, it was to protect American lives and property and maintain neutrality. But their presence on the streets absolutely intimidated any potential royalist resistance and clearly signaled U.S. support for the Committee of Safety. Liliuokalani, faced with this and wanting to avoid bloodshed, yielded her authority under protest, appealing to the U.S. government to investigate and restore her.
So the kingdom was overthrown. What happened next? Annexation wasn't immediate.
No. The Committee of Safety established a provisional government led by Sanford B. Dole and immediately sent a delegation to Washington to negotiate an annexation treaty with President Benjamin Harrison, who was sympathetic. The treaty was sent to the Senate, but before the Senate could act, Harrison lost the election to Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was anti-imperialist and suspicious about the overthrow. He withdrew the treaty from the Senate and sent former Congressman James Blount to investigate.
The Blount Report.
Yes. Blount concluded the overthrow was illegal, orchestrated with the improper involvement of U.S. Minister Stevens and the U.S. military, and that the majority of Native Hawaiians opposed annexation. Cleveland tried to restore the Queen on the condition she grant amnesty to the revolutionaries.
Did she agree?
Initially, she reportedly hesitated or demanded punishment, which gave Dole and the provisional government an excuse to refuse to step down. They then declared the Republic of Hawaii on July 4, 1894, with Dole as president, determined to wait for a more annexation-friendly U.S. administration.
Which came with McKinley.
Exactly. William McKinley, elected in 1896, was an expansionist. He submitted a new annexation treaty in 1897, but it still faced opposition in the Senate, particularly from Democrats citing the Blount Report and anti-imperialist sentiment. It looked like it might fail to get the required two-thirds vote.
So how did annexation happen?
They bypassed the treaty process. The Spanish-American War broke out in 1898. Annexationists argued Hawaii, especially Pearl Harbor, was strategically vital for the war effort in the Pacific, particularly projecting power towards the Philippines. Using the war as justification, they pushed for annexation via a joint resolution of Congress called the Newlands Resolution.
Which only needed a simple majority.
Correct. It passed both the House and Senate by majority vote. McKinley signed it on July 7, 1898. Hawaii was officially annexed. The U.S. Supreme Court later gave tacit approval in cases like DeLima v. Bidwell.
Were other countries involved? Japan?
There was concern about Japan. Japan had a large immigrant population in Hawaii and had protested against the Republic of Hawaii's attempts to restrict Japanese immigration. Years earlier, Kalakaua had actually secretly met the Japanese emperor and proposed a sort of union, maybe through marriage, but Japan wasn't interested then. In 1897, during the treaty debate, Japan did send warships to Honolulu in a show of force, protesting the potential annexation and treatment of its citizens, but ultimately didn't intervene militarily.
So Hawaii became a U.S. territory?
Yes. The Hawaiian Organic Act of 1900 formally established the territory of Hawaii, outlining its government structure. Sanford Dole was appointed the first territorial governor. The first territorial legislature met in 1901. Opponents, of course, maintained the annexation was illegal under both Hawaiian and international law. Robert Wilcox actually got elected as the first delegate to Congress, running under the banner of the Home Rule Party, opposing the oligarchy that had taken over.
What was the territorial period like? Sugar still dominant?
Oh, yes. The plantations continued to expand. The economy became even more consolidated under the control of the Big Five companies, descendants of early missionary and trading families who dominated sugar, shipping, banking, utilities, retail, basically everything.
Labor issues continued?
Big time. Lots of strikes. The 1909 strike by Japanese sugar workers was a major event, demanding better pay and conditions. There were also attempts to diversify the labor force, like bringing in Russian workers from Siberia around 1909-1910.
Russians. How did that work out?
Not well. Recruiters made false promises. They faced terrible conditions, low pay, disease outbreaks like measles, cultural clashes. Most didn't stay long, moving on to California or back home if they could.
Then came World War II, Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941. A defining moment for Hawaii and the U.S. The surprise attack killed nearly 2,500 people, sank or damaged most of the U.S. Pacific battleship fleet. Luckily, the aircraft carriers were at sea.
And Hawaii went under martial law.
Immediately. Lasted almost the entire war, until October 1944 officially, though military control eased somewhat earlier. The military governor had sweeping powers. Civil liberties were curtailed.
What about the Japanese-American population? Internment.
This is a really important distinction. Unlike on the West Coast, where over 110,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated and interned, there was no mass internment in Hawaii.
Why not? They were a much larger percentage of the population.
Several reasons. Sheer logistics, they were nearly 40% of the population. Their labor was absolutely essential to the economy and the war effort. And while there was suspicion and some leaders were arrested and interned in mainland camps, there was also a degree of trust, particularly from military intelligence who had worked with the community. Still, it was a period of intense fear and prejudice for them.
Hawaii became a massive military base.
The central hub for the entire Pacific War. Staging ground, training center, supply depot, hospital base. Hundreds of thousands of servicemen passed through. The Battle of Midway, the turning point against Japan, was directed from Pearl Harbor.
And the 442nd.
The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans, mostly volunteers from Hawaii, but also some from mainland internment camps. They fought in Italy, France, Germany.
And became legendary.
Incredibly so. They became the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Thousands of Purple Hearts, numerous presidential unit citations, medals of honor. They suffered extremely high casualties, proving their loyalty. Their motto was, "Go for broke."
After the war, things changed politically.
Significantly. The Republican Party, largely aligned with the Big Five and the old oligarchy, had dominated territorial politics. But the post-war era saw the rise of the Democratic Party, fueled by returning Maisei veterans who demanded equality, the growing power of organized labor, especially the ILW union under Jack Hall, and a desire to break the planters' control. Strikes in 1946 and 1949 were pivotal. The Democratic Revolution of 1954 finally gave the Democrats control of the legislature.
And the push for statehood intensified.
Yes. It had been debated for decades, but gained real momentum after the war, pushed by figures like John A. Burns. There were arguments against it, including racist ones on the mainland about the large non-white population, and some concerns in Hawaii about losing local control. But the pro-statehood movement, arguing for full political rights and representation, eventually won out.
The vote was decisive.
Overwhelmingly in favor in a 1959 referendum. President Eisenhower signed the Hawaii Admission Act in March 1959. On August 21, 1959, Hawaii officially became the 50th state.
But the legacy of annexation, the overthrow, that didn't just disappear.
Not at all. For many Native Hawaiians, statehood, while perhaps seen as preferable to territory status by some, didn't resolve the fundamental issue of the loss of their independent nation. The Native Hawaiian population had declined dramatically after contact, hitting a low point around 1900 before starting a slow recovery. The relationship remains complex.
And the Hawaiian Renaissance?
Starting in the late 1960s and 70s, yeah. A real resurgence of interest and pride in Hawaiian language, hula, music, navigation, history, cultural identity. A reaction against decades of suppression and assimilation. Really powerful movement.
Then the Apology Resolution in 1993.
Right. Public Law 103-150, passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton. It formally acknowledged the 100th anniversary of the overthrow, admitted the U.S. government's role in it, apologized to Native Hawaiians for the deprivation of their rights to self-determination, and expressed commitment to reconciliation.
Has it been controversial?
Yes. Some critics question its historical accuracy on certain points, like downplaying any role of Hawaiian citizens who supported the overthrow, or its narrow focus only on descendants of pre-contact inhabitants. Others feel it didn't go far enough, lacking tangible reparations or a clear path to sovereignty.
And sovereignty efforts continue, like the Akaka Bill.
Yes, the Akaka Bill was proposed several times in the 2000s. It aimed to establish a process for federal recognition of a Native Hawaiian governing entity, similar to Native American tribes. It had significant support but ultimately failed to pass Congress due to opposition raising concerns about race-based government and potential legal challenges. The conversation about sovereignty, self-governance, and reconciliation is definitely ongoing.
Wow. Okay, so charting this history, from those first voyagers navigating by stars through the complex society they built, the internal shifts like ending the kapu system, the arrival of Cook, the unification under Kamehameha, the immense pressures of westernization, the sugar industry, the overthrow, annexation, and finally statehood. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And you see that resilience of Hawaiian culture coming through again and again, despite everything.
What stands out as maybe surprising looking back?
For me, it's things like that internal overthrow of the kapu showing agency before the missionaries were a major force. The accepted nature of icon relationships, just how sophisticated the ahupu system was, and maybe how contested and debated the path to statehood really was even after the overthrow. It wasn't a simple, inevitable line.
Definitely. Understanding these layers gives you such a richer perspective on Hawaii today, beyond just the beaches and resorts.
Absolutely. Which maybe brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Given that apology resolution, given the ongoing debates about sovereignty and what was lost, what does genuine self-determination actually look like for Native Hawaiians today in this post-colonial reality? And maybe more broadly, what responsibilities do nations have when these kinds of historical injustices have clearly happened? Something to think about.